The handcuffs felt cold, but not as cold as the officer's prejudice. They thought they were arresting a random black man. They had no idea they'd just illegally detained the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The black Lincoln Continental moved with the quiet, unassuming grace of old American steel. Behind the wheel, General Marcus Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, loosened his tie. At 60, his face was a roadmap of a life lived under pressure, with deep lines etched around sharp, intelligent eyes that had assessed battlefields from 30,000 feet and stared down dictators across polished tables. Today, however, he was not General Thorne, the four-star commander of the most powerful military on earth. He was just Marcus, a man in a well-tailored but unremarkable gray suit, driving alone on a stretch of I-94 in Michigan. His destination was a small town outside Ann Arbor. It was a pilgrimage of sorts, a quiet visit to the widow of a man who had died under his command in the early days of the Iraq War. There would be no motorcade, no press, no ceremony. It was a personal debt, a promise kept in the quiet space between duty and memory. He pulled into the rest area to review his route and gather his thoughts. The portfolio on the passenger seat contained not state secrets, but a yellowed photograph of his old unit and a condolence letter he had never been satisfied with. He was so lost in thought that he didn't immediately notice the white state trooper cruiser that had pulled in behind him, its presence a sudden, jarring note in the placid, mid-morning calm. Inside the cruiser, Officer Jeffers watched him. Jeffers was a man who saw the world in simple, ugly patterns. To him, a black man in an expensive car, sitting alone at a rest stop, wasn't a traveler. He was a variable in a criminal equation. A potential drug mule, a suspect in a theft, something out of place. He didn't see a man, he saw a profile. "Dispatch, this is 3 Adam 12, Jeffers said into his radio, his voice flat with bored authority. "Got a black Lincoln, Michigan plates, occupied by a lone male, black, at the I-94 rest stop, mile marker 135. Looks suspicious. Running the plates now." He radioed his partner, Officer Reich, who was a few minutes behind him, before deciding he didn't need to wait. General Thorne saw the officer approaching in his rearview mirror and felt a familiar, weary sigh form in his chest. It was a feeling he'd known as a young lieutenant decades ago, but one he hadn't felt in years, insulated by the bubble of rank and power. He lowered his window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, a gesture of de-escalation that had become second nature to black men of every station. "Good morning, officer," the general said, his voice calm and even. "Is there a problem?" Jeffers ignored the greeting. He let his gaze sweep over the car's interior, the leather portfolio, the tailored suit. The quality of the items didn't register as marks of success, but as further points of suspicion. "We've had reports of a vehicle matching this description involved in a theft," he lied, the fabrication coming easily. "I need you to step out of the car." It wasn't a request. The general's eyes, which could convey the weight of a nation's military might with a single glance, narrowed almost imperceptibly. He analyzed Jeffers' stance, hand resting on his holstered weapon, feet bladed in a confrontational posture. He saw unprofessionalism, poor training, and the unmistakable glint of prejudice. This was not a standard traffic stop. This was a power play. "Officer, I assure you, you have the wrong vehicle," the general said, his tone still level. "My registration and license are right here. I'm on my way to a private appointment." I said, "Step out of the vehicle." "Now," Jeffers barked, his voice rising. Slowly, deliberately, General Thorne opened the door and stood up. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of decades of discipline, his 6'2" frame unfolding from the car with a quiet dignity that seemed to irritate Jeffers even more. Just as Officer Reich's cruiser pulled in, Jeffers made his next move. Without consent, he leaned into the general's car and began rummaging through the portfolio on the passenger seat. "Officer, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle," the general stated, his voice ringing with quiet authority. It was a citizen's right, a judge's declaration. For Jeffers, it was a trigger. "That's obstruction," he snapped, seeing his chance to escalate. "You're interfering." Before the general could process the absurd accusation, Jeffers grabbed his arm, twisted it behind his back with a grunt of exertion, and the cold, metallic bite of handcuffs closed around his wrist. The click of the second handcuff locking into place was a definitive, metallic sound. It echoed in the quiet air of the rest stop, a punctuation mark on a sentence of injustice. Officer Reich, the younger, hesitant partner, secured the cuff, her movements clumsy, her eyes avoiding the general's. He didn't struggle. He didn't curse. He stood perfectly still, his body ramrod straight, and spoke with a chilling serenity. "You are both making a profound and irreversible mistake." A few travelers watched from a distance, their morning coffee forgotten. A college student, sensing the wrongness of the scene, was already recording on her phone. General Thorne was gently but firmly pushed toward the back of Jeffers' cruiser. As he was folded into the cramped back seat, the hard plastic unforgiving against his tailored suit, his mind detached. The immediate, visceral anger was suppressed, filed away by decades of training. In its place, his strategic brain took over, processing the event not as a personal humiliation, but as a tactical failure on the part of the opposing force. Poor situational awareness, he thought. Escalation without justification. Complete failure to de-escalate. This is how you lose control of an engagement. The drive to the precinct was silent. The general stared out the window, the Michigan landscape blurring into a green and gray smear. The cramped space, the smell of stale air freshener, the cage separating him from the front seat, it all triggered a memory, a ghost from a lifetime ago. The world outside faded, replaced by the blistering sun and endless sand of the Iraqi desert in 1991. He was a young captain then, leading a reconnaissance patrol deep behind enemy lines during Desert Storm. Their Humvee had hit an anti-tank mine. The explosion was a chaotic symphony of twisted metal and concussive force. When he came to, he was surrounded, not by state troopers, but by soldiers of the Iraqi Republican Guard. They were professionals. Their commander, an Iraqi major with cold, intelligent eyes, had approached him. They had taken his weapon, yes, but they had also offered him water. They had treated his men's injuries before beginning their interrogation. He was a prisoner of war, an enemy combatant, yet he was afforded a basic dignity, a respect for his rank and his status as a soldier, as dictated by the conventions of war. He remembered the interrogation. The Iraqi major had sat across a simple wooden table from him in a stiflingly hot tent. There were no baseless accusations, no sloppy searches. There were direct questions, psychological pressure, and a clear, albeit hostile, objective. He was a threat to them, and they treated him as such, with a cold, calculated professionalism. They were his enemies, but they were soldiers. They understood the codes of conduct, the unwritten laws that separate warriors from thugs. The memory dissolved as the cruiser pulled into the parking lot of the state police precinct. The irony was a bitter pill. His enemy captors in a foreign war had shown more procedural discipline than these two officers in his own country. He was now a prisoner of prejudice, and it felt infinitely more degrading. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was one of mundane bureaucracy. He was uncuffed and led to a hard plastic chair in a holding area. The red marks on his wrists were stark against his dark skin. The booking officer took his driver's license, a Michigan license with his name, Marcus Thorne, and a simple, unlisted address. There was nothing on it to indicate his rank. They saw a 60-year-old black man in a suit and filled in the blanks with their own assumptions. "I need to make a phone call," the general stated calmly. "I have an appointment I need to postpone." "You'll get your call," the desk sergeant mumbled without looking up. He wouldn't. He asked twice more over the next 2 hours. Each request was met with a dismissive wave or outright ignored. He watched the life of the precinct unfold around him. Officers came and went, some giving him curious, smirking glances. He heard one of them mutter to another, "This one thinks he's important." The comment wasn't meant for him to hear, but his senses, honed by years of needing to hear the whisper of a threat in a crowded market, picked it up easily. He didn't react. He simply sat, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, a portrait of unnerving calm. Officer Jeffers swaggered past several times, a rooster preening after a successful fight. Officer Reich remained in the background, her face a canvas of growing unease. She knew, on some level, that this was wrong. But she lacked the courage or conviction to challenge her partner. Her silence was its own form of violence. The general wasn't just waiting. He was observing, gathering intelligence. He memorized names from ID badges, noted the lax security protocols, the unprofessional banter. He was mapping the command structure, identifying the weak points. And as he sat there, stripped of his rank and dignity, he felt the cold, hard certainty of his next move solidifying in his mind. This precinct, this culture of casual bigotry, was a cancer. And he was about to become the surgeon. The tipping point arrived in the form of Sergeant Pamela Yates. She was the shift supervisor, a woman in her early 50s with sharp, no-nonsense eyes and hair pulled back in a tight, practical bun. She exuded a weary competence, the kind that comes from 20 years of dealing with the daily follies of law enforcement. She was doing her rounds when she saw the general sitting alone in the holding area. She stopped, her brow furrowed. "Who's this?" she asked the room at large. "Brought in by Jeffers and Reich about 2 hours ago," a dispatcher replied without looking up. "Rest stop. Matched a bolo on a stolen vehicle. Obstruction." Yates looked at the man in the chair. He didn't look like a car thief. He looked composed. Too composed. The expensive cut of his suit, the quiet dignity in his posture, the unnerving intelligence in his eyes, it all felt dissonant, out of place. This wasn't the usual profile. "Has he had his phone call?" she asked. "He's asked a few times." Jeffers said to let him wait. Yates's frown deepened. Denying a phone call for a low-level charge like obstruction was a violation of protocol, a lazy assertion of power that often led to lawsuits. She walked over to the holding area. "Sir," she began, her tone professional. "I'm Sergeant Yates. I understand you've been requesting a phone call." "That is correct, Sergeant," the general replied, his voice even. "I've asked 3 times. I need to inform my office that I will be late for a meeting with the governor in Lansing." The mention of the governor made Yates pause. It could be a bluff, but the man's calm delivery gave it weight. "What's your name, sir?" "Marcus Thorne," he said. He then added, with deliberate, quiet emphasis, "I would strongly advise you to run that name through your system before this situation deteriorates any further." From across the room, Jeffers let out a chuckle. "He's been playing that important man card all morning, Sarge. Don't fall for it." Yates shot Jeffers a look that could curdle milk. "Officer Jeffers, I would strongly advise you to remain silent while I do my job." She turned and walked to the nearest computer terminal. The simple act of typing his name felt different now. It felt freighted with consequence. She typed, T-Thorne, Marcus. The system churned for a moment, and the file loaded. Her face went blank. She stared at the screen, her professional composure momentarily deserting her. It wasn't a criminal record that appeared. It was a wall of text that seemed impossible. She read the top line first. Thorne, Marcus L., General, O-10, U.S. Army. Her eyes scanned down, her breath catching in her throat. Current assignment, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Pentagon, Washington, D.C. Below that were security clearances that made her own state-level access look like a library card. There were commendations, service records, a photo ID that perfectly matched the man sitting 20 feet away. The blood drained from her face. They hadn't just arrested a man in a suit. They had arrested the highest-ranking military officer in the entire United States of America. For a full 10 seconds, she just stared, processing the magnitude of the blunder. This wasn't a lawsuit. This was a national incident. This was the kind of mistake that ended careers, dismantled departments, and became a case study in failure for generations of officers to come. She pushed herself away from the desk, her movements stiff. Every eye in the precinct was on her now, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. She walked back to the holding area, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Jeffers, still oblivious, smirked at her. "See? Just some nobody." Sergeant Yates unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. She faced the general, her expression a mixture of awe, horror, and profound professional embarrassment. She took a deep breath. "General Thorne," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "On behalf of the Michigan State Police, I want to offer my deepest, most sincere apology. There are no words. This should never have happened." From outside the glass, Jeffers's jaw dropped. "Wait, what did you call him?" "General." Yates turned, her eyes blazing with a fury Jeffers had never seen. "Officer Jeffers," she said, her voice low and trembling with rage. "You arrested the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You put him in handcuffs, searched his vehicle without a warrant, and denied him his rights. I suggest you find a lawyer. Immediately." The color drained from Jeffers's face. Reich looked like she was going to faint. The entire precinct was frozen in a state of collective shock. The system hadn't just been challenged. It had been shattered. The fragile silence inside the precinct was soon drowned out by the roar of the outside world. The college student who had filmed the arrest at the rest stop had uploaded her 27-second clip with a simple, potent caption: "Cops arresting a calm, well-dressed black man for no reason. He did nothing." The video was a perfect storm of viral content. It was short, shocking, and unambiguous. It showed a clear abuse of power against a man who looked like anyone's father or grandfather, a man radiating dignity even as his rights were being stripped away. It first exploded on TikTok, then, like a digital wildfire, leaped to Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The hashtag Justice for Marcus Thorne began to trend, even before anyone knew who he was. Then came the second wave. An enterprising local journalist, tipped off by the commotion at the precinct, cross-referenced the name with public records. When the result came back, the journalist thought it was a mistake. A few frantic calls to sources in Lansing and then D.C. confirmed the unthinkable. At 3:15 p.m., the headline dropped on the Lansing Gazette's website: "Exclusive, man wrongfully arrested at rest stop is 4-star General Marcus Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff." The internet broke. The story was no longer about a potential civil rights violation, it was a full-blown national crisis. The Pentagon's press office was inundated with calls. The White House press secretary was ambushed with questions during a routine briefing. Major news networks broke into their regular programming. The video of the arrest was now played on a loop, but with a new, explosive context. The quiet man in the suit wasn't just a citizen, he was the leader of the entire U.S. military. The reaction was seismic. Veterans organizations across the country issued furious statements. Photos began to circulate of General Thorne in his Class A uniform, his chest heavy with medals, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, Purple Hearts, placed side by side with the grainy screenshot of him in handcuffs. The visual contrast was devastating. The man who had faced down America's enemies was being treated like a common criminal by his own countrymen. Protests, which had already begun to form outside the Jackson precinct, swelled in size. But now, the crowd was different. Mixed in with the civil rights activists were dozens, then hundreds, of veterans. Old men in VFW hats stood shoulder to shoulder with young men and women in hoodies bearing the insignia of the 101st Airborne and the 1st Marine Division. They didn't chant loudly. They just stood there, a silent, powerful testament, their presence a far more potent condemnation than any shouted slogan. Their signs were simple and heartbreaking: "I served too, is this how you treat a hero?" and "We fought for this." The incident transcended partisan politics. Politicians from both sides of the aisle rushed to condemn the arrest, sensing the profound cultural nerve it had struck. This was no longer just about race, it was about honor, service, and a fundamental breach of the nation's promise to its protectors. Foreign news outlets picked up the story, with headlines in London, Berlin, and Tokyo questioning the stability and fairness of the American justice system. Inside the White House, the president convened an emergency meeting in the Situation Room. This was now a matter of national security. The morale of the armed forces was at stake. The nation standing on the world stage had been damaged. And at the center of it all was General Marcus Thorne. By the time he was released from the precinct, the world had already been turned upside down. He walked out not into the quiet afternoon he had planned, but into a maelstrom of flashing cameras and shouted questions. He didn't stop to speak. Flanked by Sergeant Yates and a hastily assembled security detail of senior state troopers who looked at him with awe and terror, he was whisked away in an unmarked car. But his image, calm, dignified, wronged, was now burned into the global consciousness. He hadn't said a word to the public, yet his silence was the loudest sound in the world. The fallout was so swift and severe that it forced the state government into unprecedented action. Within 24 hours, under immense pressure from the White House, the Pentagon, and a volcanically angry public, the governor of Michigan announced the formation of a special emergency committee. It wasn't to be a quiet internal review. It was to be a public, televised joint session of the state Senate and House Judiciary Committees, broadcast live, to investigate the systemic failures that led to the illegal detention of the nation's highest-ranking military officer. Officers Jeffers and Reich were immediately suspended without pay and compelled to attend. Their lives had imploded. Jeffers, once the swaggering king of his small highway kingdom, was now a national pariah, his face synonymous with racist policing. Reich, the silent partner, found herself vilified for her complicity, a symbol of the good officer who does nothing. The hearing was held in the grand chamber of the state capitol. The room, usually reserved for gubernatorial addresses, was packed. Every major news network had a camera crew. Seated in the front rows were state senators, representatives, the attorney general, and a phalanx of stern-faced lawyers from the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense. The main witness, the man the entire country was waiting to hear from, was General Marcus Thorne. He entered the chamber not in the civilian suit he was arrested in, but in his full Class A uniform. The sight was breathtaking. The deep blue fabric was adorned with the architecture of a legendary career. 4 silver stars glittered on each shoulder. Below them, a kaleidoscope of ribbons and medals told a story of valor and sacrifice: the Medal of Honor, awarded for an act of near-suicidal bravery in Mogadishu, the Silver Star for gallantry in Afghanistan, the Bronze Stars for meritorious service under fire. He was no longer an anonymous traveler. He was the living embodiment of the American military ideal. As he walked toward the witness table, the entire chamber, including the governor, rose to its feet in a spontaneous show of respect. The silence was absolute, broken only by the quiet click of his polished shoes on the marble floor. He took his seat, his posture perfect, his gaze sweeping across the room, finally settling on the 2 officers who had arrested him. They flinched, refusing to meet his eyes. General Thorne, the committee chairman, began, his voice filled with reverence. The nation is grateful for your willingness to speak today. Please, tell us in your own words what transpired. The general leaned into the microphone, and his calm, measured voice filled the cavernous room. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 2 days ago, I was subjected to an illegal stop, an illegal search, and an illegal arrest by officers of this state. But I am not here today to speak of my own indignation. My pride is not so fragile. I am here to speak about a threat. He paused, letting the word hang in the air. I have spent my life confronting threats to this nation. I have faced them on foreign battlefields, in the shadows of covert operations, and across negotiating tables. But the threat I witnessed 2 days ago is more insidious than any of them. It is a threat from within. He looked directly at Jeffers and Reich. It is the threat of laziness. The laziness that substitutes a profile for probable cause. It is the threat of arrogance. The arrogance that places the power of a badge above the rights of a citizen. And it is the threat of prejudice. The ugly, corrosive prejudice that assumes guilt based on the color of a man's skin, regardless of the content of his character or the dignity of his bearing. His voice never rose, but its power was immense. It was the voice of command, of absolute moral authority. When Officer Jeffers put handcuffs on me, the general continued, he did not just assault a citizen. He assaulted the very principles he swore an oath to defend. The oath I took, and every soldier, sailor, airman, and marine takes, is not to a man or a political party. It is to the Constitution. The same Constitution that Officer Jeffers and Officer Reich treated as an inconvenience. They did not see a citizen to be protected. They saw a suspect to be processed. Their actions were not an anomaly, they were the symptom of a sickness. A sickness of low standards, poor training, and a lack of accountability. In my world, Mr. Chairman, when a unit fails this catastrophically, we do not just discipline the soldiers. We relieve the command. We tear down the failed system and rebuild it from the foundation up. Because a threat to the integrity of our own institutions is a threat to the security of the entire nation. He concluded his testimony. He had not yelled. He had not accused them of racism directly. He had simply dissected their failure with the cold, undeniable precision of a surgeon. The chairman, visibly moved, cleared his throat. Thank you, General. Your testimony has illuminated the gravity of this situation. He turned to the State Attorney General. In light of this testimony and the overwhelming evidence, what is the state's immediate course of action? The Attorney General stood. Effective immediately, the Department of Justice, in conjunction with my office, is launching a full-scale pattern or practice investigation into the Michigan State Police, focusing on training, supervision, and civil rights compliance. Officers Jeffers and Reich will face a federal grand jury. It was over. The general's testimony hadn't just been a statement, it had been a verdict. The reforms came swiftly. Spurred by the national attention and the undeniable moral force of the general's testimony, the state legislature fast-tracked a new bill. It was unofficially nicknamed the Thorne Act. It mandated sweeping changes to police training, established a new, independent civilian oversight board with subpoena power, and implemented a statewide system for automatically flagging officers with multiple complaints for review. General Thorne recused himself from any further public involvement in the case, returning to his duties at the Pentagon. He had done what he needed to do. The system, now under a microscope, would have to correct itself. Jeffers and Reich were indicted by a federal grand jury a month later, their careers in ruins, their names a permanent footnote in the annals of police misconduct. 3 months after the arrest, on a quiet Saturday morning, General Thorne's black Lincoln Continental once again pulled onto a quiet residential street in the small town outside Ann Arbor. He walked up the path to a modest, well-kept house. The door opened, and a woman in her late 50s, with kind, sad eyes, greeted him. She was Sarah Connell, the widow of Sergeant Major James Connell, the man whose family he had been on his way to visit that fateful morning. "Marcus," she said softly, ushering him in. "I saw you on the news. I am so sorry for what you went through." Inside, the house was filled with photos of a smiling man in uniform. James Connell, a hero who had died saving 3 men in his platoon. The general sat on the couch, the powerful chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and simply talked with the widow of his friend. He told her stories of her husband's bravery, of his humor. He listened as she spoke of her children, of her struggles, of her pride. For 2 hours, he was not a general, not a symbol, not a headline. He was just Marcus, a soldier paying his respects to a fallen brother. He had faced down prejudice and had held a system accountable on a national stage. But here, in this quiet living room, he was fulfilling the most sacred duty of all, honoring the fallen and taking care of their own. As he left, he knew this was the true foundation of the country he served, not the power or the politics, but the quiet bonds of honor that held it all together. A nation's strength is not just in its armies, but in its principles. General Thorne's quiet dignity was a reminder that the greatest battles are often fought for the soul of a country. If this story moved you, share it to honor those who serve with integrity and subscribe for more stories that matter. And in the comments below, tell us what honor means to you.